I'm standing on my late grandfather's wraparound porch, watching my parents and sister climb out of their cars with the biggest smiles I've seen since Christmas morning. Behind them, two moving trucks rumble down Maple Street, their engines echoing off the Victorian houses that line this quiet neighborhood. Sarah waves at me like she's greeting an old friend, not someone she's about to evict from his own home. My father Marcus adjusts his tie and grins while my mother Linda practically skips up the brick walkway. They're holding legal documents, laughing about something completely confident in whatever plan they've cooked up. But I'm not moving from this spot, and I'm definitely not packing my belongings. 3 weeks ago, right after my college graduation ceremony, I quietly transferred this entire $1 million estate into an irrevocable trust with myself as the sole beneficiary. The manila folder in my hands contains documents they know absolutely nothing about. The past 6 months have been a whirlwind of legal battles, family drama, and painful discoveries about the people I thought I knew best. It all started last November when Grandpa Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep at 87 years old. The whole family gathered at Patricia Sullivan's law office downtown for the will reading, and everyone just assumed the estate would be split 3 ways among his children. I remember sitting in that stuffy conference room with its dark wood paneling and law books stacked floor to ceiling, watching my relatives whisper among themselves about how they'd divide up Walter's assets. Sarah had already started browsing interior design magazines, planning to modernize what she called his dusty old Victorian. My parents discussed selling his antique car collection to fund their upcoming cruise to Alaska. Nobody seemed particularly sad about losing the man who'd raised 3 children as a widower after Grandma Rose died young. When Patricia cleared her throat and began reading, the room fell silent. Walter had left his entire estate to me. The Victorian mansion on Maple Street, worth approximately $1.2 million, investment accounts totaling $800,000. His collection of vintage Corvettes valued at $300,000. Even his rare book collection and antique furniture. Everything went to his 22-year-old grandson, who just finished his business degree. The explosion of outrage was immediate and deafening. Marcus shot to his feet, his face turning crimson, as he demanded to know how this was possible. Linda burst into tears, sobbing about how unfair it was that her own father had cut her out completely. Sarah screamed that I must have poisoned Walter's mind against his own children, taking advantage of an elderly man's declining mental state. But I knew the truth that none of them wanted to hear. Walter hadn't been declining at all. His mind stayed sharp right until his final breath, and he'd made this decision after years of watching his children ignore him completely. While they were busy with their own lives, I was the one who visited every Sunday after church. I helped him fix the leaky kitchen faucet, organized his medications, and listened to his stories about serving in Korea and building his construction business from nothing. More importantly, I was the only one who noticed when local developers started circling the neighborhood like vultures, pressuring elderly homeowners to sell their properties for a fraction of their worth. Walter spent his last 2 years documenting their predatory practices, and he'd chosen me as his heir because he trusted me to continue protecting what he'd built. Within a week of the will reading, Marcus hired Jonathan Hayes, one of the most aggressive probate attorneys in the state. Hayes immediately filed paperwork to contest the will, claiming Walter had been mentally incompetent when he'd changed his beneficiary. My father was determined to prove that I'd manipulated a sick old man into giving me everything. The legal battles consumed the next 5 months. I continued living in Walter's house while finishing my final semester at State University, driving the 40-minute commute each day in his pristine 1967 Corvette. Every evening I'd return to find process servers waiting with new court documents or investigators, asking neighbors questions about Walter's mental state during his final years. Living alone in that big house gave me time to explore rooms I'd never really examined before. Walter's study was filled with filing cabinets containing decades of business records, family photographs, and personal journals. Reading through his handwritten entries, I discovered the depth of his disappointment with his own children. He'd written extensively about Marcus's gambling problems and the money he'd quietly loaned him over the years, never expecting repayment. He documented Linda's alcoholism and the embarrassing scenes she'd caused at family gatherings. Most painfully, he'd recorded Sarah's increasingly desperate requests for advance inheritance money to fund her husband's failing restaurant ventures. The journals revealed Walter's master plan. He'd deliberately left everything to me, initially knowing his children would fight the decision in court. This would give me time to mature and learn about handling wealth responsibly while watching how my relatives reacted to being cut out. Walter wanted me to see their true nature before deciding how to move forward. His final entry, dated just 3 days before his death, simply read, "Brendan has grown into the man I hoped he'd become. He visits because he loves me, not because he wants something from me. When the fighting starts, he'll understand why this had to be done. The choice of what happens next will be his to make." 3 weeks after my graduation ceremony, everything changed in the span of a single phone conversation. I was in Walter's kitchen making coffee when I heard my father's voice coming from the garden outside the open window. He was talking on his cell phone, pacing back and forth among Walter's prized rose bushes, completely unaware that I could hear every word he was saying. "Judge Crawford, this is Marcus Thompson," he said in the overly friendly tone he used when he wanted something. I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last week about my father's estate situation. I froze with the coffee pot halfway to my cup. Judge Robert Crawford was the probate judge assigned to our case, and hearing my father address him so casually sent ice water through my veins. "Yes, I understand these things take time," Marcus continued, "but my family really needs this resolved quickly. My daughter's been planning to move into the house, and we've already made commitments based on receiving the inheritance." There was a long pause while Crawford spoke on the other end. I crept closer to the window, straining to hear. "Absolutely, I appreciate everything you're doing for us," my father said. "And I want you to know that your next campaign is very important to our whole family. We'd be honored to make a substantial contribution to support your re-election. Something in the neighborhood of $25,000, assuming this unfortunate situation gets resolved in our favor." My blood turned to ice. My own father was bribing a sitting judge to steal my inheritance. I grabbed my phone and started recording, though I'd already missed the beginning of their conversation. "I think the mental incompetence angle is our strongest approach," Marcus said. "My father had been showing signs of dementia for months before he changed his will. It's obvious that Brendan took advantage of a confused elderly man who didn't understand what he was signing. That was a complete lie. Walter had been mentally sharp until his final day, capable of discussing complex financial matters and remembering details from decades past. But apparently my family was willing to destroy his memory and reputation to get their hands on his money." "Perfect," Marcus concluded. "Sarah will be so relieved to hear that you're expediting the hearing. We'll have those medical evaluations ready for you by Friday, and I'll make sure that campaign contribution gets processed immediately after the ruling." After he hung up and walked away, I sat in Walter's kitchen feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about family greed anymore. They'd corrupted the entire legal system to steal what Walter had wanted me to have. I called Patricia Sullivan immediately, but her secretary said she was in court all day. When she finally returned my call that evening, her voice sounded strained and exhausted. "Brendan, I'm glad you called," she said. "I've been meaning to discuss some developments in your case. I've been receiving some pressure from the State Bar Association to encourage you to settle this matter out of court." "What kind of pressure?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Apparently, some influential people think this inheritance dispute has dragged on too long and should be resolved quietly. They're suggesting that fighting your family's claims might not be in your best interests especially given your age and inexperience with managing large estates. Patricia had been Walter's attorney for over 20 years, and she'd never backed down from a fight before. Hearing defeat in her voice told me that the corruption went deeper than just Judge Crawford. "Are you saying you think I should give up?" I asked. "I'm saying that I'm 68 years old and considering retirement rather than fighting a system that's been compromised," she replied sadly. "If I step down as your attorney, you'll need to find new representation, and that could take months." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Walter's journals and his documentation of local corruption. Finally, around 3 in the morning, I went to his study and started searching through filing cabinets I'd never opened before. Hidden behind tax records from the 1980s, I found a small safe built into the wall. Walter had given me the combination years ago, telling me it was important family information I might need someday. Inside the safe were documents that made my blood run cold. Walter had been investigating local government corruption for years, documenting connections between Judge Crawford, several city council members, and a development company called Meridian Properties. The files contained photographs of secret meetings, copies of campaign finance records, and detailed timelines showing how certain zoning decisions had benefited Meridian's projects. Walter had uncovered a systematic pattern of bribery and influence peddling that went back over a decade. Most shocking of all, I found blueprints showing Meridian's plans for our neighborhood. They wanted to demolish an entire block of historic Victorian homes, including Walter's house, to build a massive shopping complex. The company had been systematically buying properties from elderly homeowners at below-market prices, pressuring them to sell through intimidation and false claims about declining property values. Walter's house sat on the most valuable corner lot in their development plans. Without it, their entire project would collapse. This wasn't just about my family's greed anymore. Powerful people with deep pockets wanted Walter's property, and they'd found willing accomplices in his own children. I discovered that Sarah had already signed preliminary agreements to sell the estate to Meridian immediately upon gaining ownership. She'd negotiated a quick sale price of only $800,000 for property worth over $1 million in exchange for immediate cash payment within 30 days of transfer. Everything made sense now. My family wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance. They were pawns in a much larger conspiracy to destroy the neighborhood Walter had spent his life trying to protect. The next morning, I drove 2 hours to the state capitol and walked into the offices of Foster & Associates, a law firm that specialized in estate planning and white-collar crime defense. I'd found their name in one of Walter's files, along with a handwritten note saying, "If anything happens to me, these people can be trusted." Daniel Foster was a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who listened to my entire story without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished explaining about the corruption and my family's involvement, he leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," he said finally. "He contacted us about 6 months before his death, wanting to set up contingency plans in case his family tried to contest his will through fraudulent means." My heart nearly stopped. He knew this would happen? Walter suspected it, yes. He'd been documenting corruption in your county for years, and he knew powerful people wanted his property. He also knew his children well enough to predict how they'd react to being disinherited. Daniel opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder with my name on it. "He left instructions for creating an irrevocable trust in your name, but only if you came here voluntarily after learning the full scope of what you were facing. He wanted you to understand the stakes before taking this step. Creating the trust required extensive documentation proving my mental competency and financial understanding." Daniel arranged for comprehensive psychological evaluations, financial literacy tests, and recorded statements explaining my decision-making process. We completed everything in absolute secrecy over the course of a week, working evenings and weekends to avoid detection. The irrevocable trust made me the sole beneficiary and trustee of Walter's entire estate, Once established, the trust couldn't be altered or dissolved by court order, even if I was declared mentally incompetent. The property would remain protected regardless of what legal challenges my family might mount. But while I was securing the inheritance legally, my relatives were mounting their own offensive on a completely different front. My cousin Ashley called me Wednesday evening, her voice shaking with worry. "Brendan, I need to tell you something that Sarah made me promise not to share," she said. "She's been spreading rumors around town about your mental health, telling people that you've been acting strange since Walter died." "What kind of rumors?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "She's claiming you've been talking to yourself in the house, staying up all night rearranging Walter's belongings and making paranoid accusations about family members trying to steal from you. She told my mom that you've been acting so erratic that she's worried about your safety." The manipulation was more sophisticated than I'd expected. Sarah wasn't just challenging my legal right to the inheritance. She was systematically destroying my reputation and credibility in the community. If people believed I was mentally unstable, it would be much easier for Judge Crawford to rule against me. "There's more," Ashley continued reluctantly. "She showed me some medical records claiming you sought psychiatric treatment for depression and paranoid delusions after Walter's funeral." "Those are completely fake," I said immediately. "I've never seen a psychiatrist in my life." "I know they're fake, but they look really official. Sarah has been showing them to people around town, building support for the idea that you're not capable of managing Walter's estate." The forgeries were sophisticated enough to fool casual observers. Someone with access to medical formatting software and official letterhead had created convincing documents suggesting I'd been treated for severe depression and paranoid ideation at Regional Medical Center's psychiatric unit. I confronted my college roommate Jake the next day, finding him at his apartment near campus. He looked guilty the moment he opened the door, unable to meet my eyes. "Sarah offered you money, didn't she?" I asked directly. Jake's shoulders sagged in defeat. "She said she'd pay me $5,000 to sign a statement saying you'd talked about suicide and seemed mentally unstable during your final semester. She claimed she was worried about your safety and needed documentation to get you help. But you didn't sign it." "Of course not. You're the most level-headed person I know." "But she found other people who were willing to lie for money." The scope of Sarah's deception was breathtaking. She'd systematically approached my college acquaintances, offering cash payments for sworn statements about my alleged mental instability. Most had refused, but a few desperate students had been willing to perjure themselves for quick money. Friday afternoon, a process server appeared at Walter's front door with documents that made my blood run cold. My family had petitioned the court for emergency guardianship, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage the inheritance due to severe psychological disturbance following Walter's death. The petition included the forged medical records, purchased affidavits from college acquaintances, and sworn statements from my parents describing my alleged erratic behavior. They'd scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday morning, hoping to catch me off guard and unprepared. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. Have me declared mentally incompetent on Monday, assign Sarah as my guardian, with control over all financial decisions, then immediately transfer the estate to her name and sell it to Meridian Properties. By the time I could mount any legal challenge, the house would be demolished and the evidence of corruption buried under concrete and steel. Saturday night, I sat in Walter's study reading his journals one final time, preparing for what I knew would be the fight of my life. Sunday morning would bring my family to the door with moving trucks, confident that their conspiracy had succeeded. They had no idea that while they'd been forging documents and bribing judges, I'd been quietly moving all of Walter's assets beyond their reach forever. As I watched the sun set over the neighborhood Walter had loved so much, I felt his presence in every corner of the house he'd built with his own hands. Tomorrow would determine whether his legacy survived or whether corruption and greed would finally tear apart everything he'd worked to protect. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear with autumn sunlight filtering through the maple trees that gave our street its name. I stood at the living room window, watching my family's cars turn the corner, followed by two enormous moving trucks. Sarah was riding in the passenger seat of the first truck, pointing toward the house and gesticulating excitedly to the driver. My parents climbed out of their sedan, both dressed in their finest clothes as if they were attending a celebration rather than an eviction. Marcus wore his lucky navy suit, the one he'd worn to Sarah's wedding and my graduation ceremony. Linda had on her pearl necklace and the smile she usually reserved for church functions and neighborhood association meetings. Sarah bounded out of the moving truck like a kid on Christmas morning, already barking orders at the crew about which boxes should go where. She was carrying a leather portfolio that I assumed contained all her forged documents and fraudulent court orders. Behind them, movers began unloading dollies and moving blankets, preparing to strip the house of everything Walter had accumulated over 8 decades of life. They approached the front porch with absolute confidence, chatting and laughing among themselves. Sarah pulled out her phone to take a selfie in front of what she clearly believed was now her house, probably planning to post it on social media with some caption about finally getting what she deserved. But as they climbed the steps, their expressions began to change. I was standing on the porch as they'd expected, but I wasn't alone, and I definitely wasn't packing my belongings into cardboard boxes. Beside me stood a man in a dark charcoal suit who looked nothing like anyone they'd ever seen before. He was tall and lean with graying temples and the kind of steady gaze that came from years of interrogating people who thought they were smarter than the law. His posture radiated authority, and the way he studied my approaching family members suggested he knew far more about them than they could possibly imagine. Agent William Thompson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived at dawn carrying a briefcase full of evidence and federal arrest warrants that would change everything about this Sunday morning confrontation. "Good morning," Agent Thompson said calmly, as my family reached the top of the porch steps. He pulled out his credentials and held them up for everyone to see. "I'm Agent Thompson with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. I believe we need to have a conversation." The transformation in my family's demeanor was instantaneous and complete. Marcus went pale, his confident smile evaporating like morning mist. Linda's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls, as if they might somehow protect her from federal law enforcement. Sarah's leather portfolio slipped from her fingers, spilling forged documents across the painted porch boards. "I don't understand." Marcus stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "We're just here to help our son move his belongings. There must be some mistake." "Oh, there's been a mistake, all right," Agent Thompson replied, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick manila folder. "But it wasn't made by the Bureau. We've been investigating public corruption and real estate fraud in this county for the past 18 months, and your family has provided us with some very interesting evidence." Sarah found her voice first, probably because she'd had the most practice lying. "This is harassment," she declared, though her voice shook with barely controlled panic. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just trying to help our mentally unstable relative get the care he needs." Agent Thompson's smile was as cold as January wind. "Mentally unstable? Is that what you call the young man who's been working undercover with federal law enforcement for the past 3 months?" The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear birds singing in Walter's oak tree and the distant sound of church bells from St. Mary's downtown. My family stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just heard. "You see," Agent Thompson continued, "Walter Thompson wasn't just your grandfather, Brendan. He was also a federal informant who'd been documenting corruption in local government and real estate development for years. His decision to leave you his estate wasn't just about love, though that was certainly part of it. It was about ensuring that his evidence would survive his death and that justice would eventually be served." He pulled out a handheld recording device and pressed play. Suddenly, Marcus's voice filled the morning air. "Judge Crawford, this is Marcus Thompson. I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last week about my father's estate situation. My father's face went white as he heard his own words offering $25,000 in bribes to a sitting judge. Linda sank down onto the porch swing, apparently unable to remain standing, as the full scope of their legal jeopardy became clear. That recording was made last Tuesday, Agent Thompson explained. We have similar recordings of phone conversations between Sarah and representatives from Meridian Properties discussing the sale of this estate before she'd legally obtained ownership. We also have documentation of the forged medical records, the perjured affidavits, and the systematic conspiracy to defraud Brendan of his legitimate inheritance. The moving truck sat idling in the street, their crews probably wondering why their customers were having what appeared to be a very serious conversation with a federal agent. Neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity and the obvious tension radiating from our front porch. "This is entrapment," Sarah said desperately, grasping for any possible defense. "If Brendan was working with you people, then you tricked us into committing crimes." "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time since my family had arrived, "entrapment only applies when law enforcement officers induce someone to commit crimes they wouldn't have committed otherwise. Nobody forced you to forge medical records, bribe judges, or conspire with developers to steal property that legally belongs to me." Agent Thompson nodded approvingly. "Brendan is correct. The FBI doesn't consider it entrapment when we simply provide opportunities for criminals to reveal their true nature. Everything your family did, you did voluntarily and with full knowledge that it was wrong." He signaled to unmarked vehicles that had been parked discreetly around the neighborhood. Federal agents emerged and began walking toward our house, moving with the calm efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Marcus Thompson. Agent Thompson announced formally, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit bribery, wire fraud, and violation of federal corruption statutes." As handcuffs clicked around my father's wrists, and Agent Thompson began reading him his Miranda rights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete and total vindication. The manila folder in my hands contained more than just trust documents. It held evidence of my family's crimes recordings, of their conspiracies, and proof that Walter's faith in me had been justified. The moving trucks pulled away, empty, their services no longer needed. My family's dreams of easy money and unearned luxury disappeared with them, replaced by the harsh reality of federal prosecution and public disgrace. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs toward an unmarked federal sedan, Linda and Sarah stood on the porch in stunned silence, apparently unable to comprehend how completely their plans had unraveled. The neighbors who'd gathered to watch the commotion whispered among themselves, pointing and taking pictures with their phones. "I think it's time for complete honesty," I said, opening the manila folder I'd been holding since they'd arrived. "There are things you need to know about the past few months and about Grandpa Walter's real plan." Agent Thompson gestured for Linda and Sarah to sit down on the porch furniture Walter had refinished himself years ago. They complied, mechanically moving like people in shock who were operating on autopilot rather than conscious thought. "First," I continued, "every conversation we've had since Walter's funeral has been recorded with FBI approval. Daniel Foster isn't just any attorney. He's a former federal prosecutor who specializes in public corruption cases. The trust we created wasn't just about protecting the inheritance. It was about ensuring that your criminal conspiracy would be properly documented and prosecuted." I pulled out a small digital recorder, no bigger than a matchbook, and set it on the wicker table between us. This device was in my pocket during every family gathering, every legal meeting, every private conversation where you plotted to steal what Walter had left me. Sarah's face crumpled as she realized the full extent of her exposure. "You've been spying on your own family." "No," I replied firmly. "I've been protecting myself from people who were willing to commit federal crimes to steal my inheritance. Walter warned me this would happen, and he prepared me to document everything." Agent Thompson opened his briefcase again and pulled out a thick file folder labeled Operation Maple Street. Inside were photographs of secret meetings between my family and Meridian Properties, executives' transcripts of recorded phone calls, and copies of bank records showing suspicious financial transactions. Your grandfather recruited Brendan 3 months before his death, Agent Thompson explained. Walter had been working with our public corruption unit for over a year documenting systematic fraud in local real estate development and government contracting. He knew his own children were involved in the conspiracy, and he wanted to ensure they'd be caught in the act after his death. The revelation hit Linda like a physical blow. Walter knew he knew what we were planning. He knew you'd been meeting with Meridian Properties for months before he died, I confirmed. He knew about the preliminary sales agreements, the pressure to sell below market value, and the bribes you'd arranged with Judge Crawford. He also knew about Sarah's gambling debts and the money she'd borrowed against her expected inheritance. Sarah's mouth fell open. How could he possibly know about that? Because he wasn't the senile old man you thought he was, I said. Walter had private investigators documenting your activities for months. He knew about your husband's failing restaurant, your underwater mortgage, and the loan sharks who were pressuring you for repayment. He knew exactly why you needed quick access to his money. Agent Thompson spread photographs across the table, showing Sarah entering a downtown office building that housed several payday loan companies and check-cashing operations. Other photos showed her meeting with men who were clearly not legitimate business people. The people you borrowed money from don't file reports with credit agencies, Agent Thompson said coldly. They prefer more direct collection methods. Your grandfather knew you'd put yourself in a position where you'd do anything to get his estate quickly, including committing federal crimes. Linda began crying finally, understanding the depth of Walter's disappointment with his children. We never meant for things to go this far. We just thought Brendan was too young to handle so much money responsibly. Really? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Is that why you forged medical records claiming I was mentally ill? Is that why you bribed a judge and conspired with developers to sell Walter's house for a fraction of its value? Agent Thompson consulted his notes. According to our investigation, Meridian Properties has used similar tactics to acquire over 30 properties in this neighborhood during the past 5 years. They target elderly homeowners with pressure tactics, false claims about declining property values, and systematic harassment until people agree to sell below market prices. He showed us aerial photographs of the proposed development, a massive shopping complex that would have replaced 6 blocks of historic homes with parking lots and chain stores. Walter's corner lot was the keystone property that would make the entire project feasible. Your grandfather spent the last 2 years of his life documenting these predatory practices, Agent Thompson continued. He worked with our office to build cases against corrupt officials, fraudulent developers, and the financial institutions that enabled their schemes. The scope of Walter's investigation was breathtaking. He'd maintained detailed files on Judge Crawford's suspicious rulings, city council members who'd received unexplained campaign contributions, and bank officials who'd approved questionable development loans. His evidence had led to indictments that went far beyond our family's small-scale corruption. Walter's final recordings were made just 2 days before he died, I said, pulling out a laptop computer that had been hidden in his study. He wanted you to hear his actual feelings about what you'd become. I pressed play, and suddenly Walter's familiar voice filled the morning air. He sounded strong and clear, nothing like the confused elderly man my family had described in their court filings. If you're listening to this, it means my children have revealed their true nature, and Brendan has learned the hard lessons I hoped he'd never need to learn. Walter's voice said, I didn't cut you out of my will because I stopped loving you. I cut you out because enabling your destructive behavior would have been the cruelest thing I could do to you. Linda sobbed harder as her father's voice continued from beyond the grave. Marcus, your gambling addiction has cost you 3 jobs and nearly destroyed your marriage. Giving you money would have been like giving alcohol to a drunk? Linda, your drinking problem has embarrassed this family for years. And you've used guilt and manipulation to avoid taking responsibility for your actions. And Sarah, your financial recklessness has put your children's future at risk. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Walter explaining exactly how he'd discovered each of their secrets and why he'd chosen to leave everything to me instead. His voice never rose in anger, but the disappointment was devastating to hear. Brendan earned this inheritance by loving me unconditionally and helping me without expecting anything in return, Walter concluded. But more importantly, he's earned the right to decide whether his family deserves forgiveness and a chance at redemption. That choice is his to make, not mine. As the recording ended, Agent Thompson stood up and signaled to his colleagues. Linda Thompson and Sarah Mitchell, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud forgery of official documents and participation in a racketeering enterprise. While they were being processed and read their rights, I sat alone on Walter's porch holding the trust documents that would protect his legacy forever. The irrevocable trust meant that no court order, no matter how corrupt, could ever take this property away from me or the causes Walter had cared about. But as I watched my mother and sister being led away in handcuffs, I realized that winning the legal battle was only the beginning. The harder question was what to do with the victory Walter had made possible, and whether his children could ever learn the lessons he died hoping they'd understand. 6 months after that Sunday morning confrontation, I sat in a federal courthouse downtown, watching Judge Patricia Williams sentence the people who'd once been the most important figures in my life. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighborhood residents, and other victims of the corruption ring that Walter's investigation had exposed. Marcus was the first to face judgment. He stood before the bench wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, a far cry from the confident businessman who'd tried to bribe his way to my inheritance. His gambling addiction had cost him his job, his reputation, and now his freedom. Marcus Thompson. Judge Williams announced, "You are hereby sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit bribery and wire fraud. Additionally, you will serve 2 years of supervised probation and perform 500 hours of community service upon your release." My father accepted his sentence without visible emotion, though I noticed his hands shaking as the bailiff led him away. His attorney had negotiated a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation with ongoing corruption investigations. But 2 years would still give him plenty of time to think about the choices that had brought him to this point. Sarah's sentencing was more difficult to watch. She'd lost significant weight during the months of legal proceedings, and her usually perfect appearance had deteriorated to the point where she looked like a stranger. Her husband had filed for divorce and moved their children to another state, leaving her completely alone to face the consequences of her actions. Sarah Mitchell. Judge Williams said, "You are sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. You will also serve 3 years of supervised probation and pay restitution to the victims of your fraudulent schemes." Sarah began crying as she was handcuffed, finally understanding that her desperate attempts to solve financial problems through criminal means had cost her everything she'd claimed to be trying to protect. Her children would grow up knowing their mother was a convicted felon. Linda received the lightest sentence because her role in the conspiracy had been more limited. Judge Williams sentenced her to 2 years of probation, 6 months of house arrest, and 1,000 hours of community service. She would avoid prison, but her reputation in the community where she'd lived her entire life was permanently destroyed. The biggest fish in Walter's corruption investigation was Judge Robert Crawford himself. His sentencing hearing had taken place the week before, resulting in a 10-year federal prison sentence for accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, and abuse of his judicial office. The FBI had uncovered evidence that he'd been taking payments from developers and attorneys for over a decade, affecting hundreds of cases and thousands of lives. Meridian Properties and its executives faced even harsher justice. The company was dissolved entirely, with its assets seized to pay restitution to the families they'd defrauded. 3 executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, and the proposed shopping complex that would have destroyed our neighborhood was permanently canceled. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was difficult to describe. Justice had been served, but it had come at the cost of destroying relationships with people I'd once loved and trusted. Walter's plan had worked perfectly, but its success felt more like a funeral than a celebration. I drove back to Maple Street and parked in the driveway of the house that was now permanently protected by the irrevocable trust. The neighborhood had returned to its quiet normalcy, with children playing on sidewalks and elderly residents tending their gardens without fear of developers pressuring them to sell. Inside Walter's study, I found the final sealed envelope he'd left for me marked "Open after justice." His instructions had been specific. This letter was only to be read after all legal proceedings were complete and the corruption had been fully exposed. The envelope contained a single handwritten page and 3 smaller sealed envelopes marked with my parents' and sister's names. Walter's final message was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Dear Brendan, if you're reading this, it means the justice system worked the way it was supposed to, despite the corruption that tried to subvert it. You've learned hard lessons about the people closest to you, but I hope you've also learned about your own strength and integrity under pressure. The money was never the point. The real inheritance I'm leaving you is the knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it's painful, is the only way to live with yourself. But justice without mercy becomes cruelty, and strength without compassion becomes tyranny. Your family made terrible choices, but they're still your family. Inside these sealed envelopes are my final words to each of them, not words of condemnation, but of conditional forgiveness. They can earn redemption if they're willing to do the work, but only if they acknowledge their mistakes and commit to making amends. The choice of whether to give them these letters is yours to make. You've proven yourself worthy of this inheritance, but the greater test is whether you can use your victory to heal rather than to punish. Build the family I always hoped we could become. That would be the greatest honor you could give to my memory. The 3 sealed letters sat on Walter's desk like a final test of my character. I could keep them forever, denying my family any chance at Walter's forgiveness. Or I could honor his deeper wisdom about redemption and second chances even for people who'd betrayed my trust in the cruelest possible ways. As evening shadows lengthened across Walter's study, I made the decision that would determine whether his legacy would be defined by justice alone or by the more difficult combination of justice and mercy that he'd spent his lifetime trying to embody. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, I stood in Walter's kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, preparing dinner for a family gathering that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. The house smelled of roasting turkey and fresh-baked rolls, the same aromas that had filled this space during Walter's lifetime, when he'd insisted on hosting every major holiday. The dining room table was set for 6 people, though the guest list would have shocked anyone who knew our recent history. Marcus had been released from federal prison 3 weeks earlier, having served 16 months of his 2-year sentence for good behavior and cooperation with ongoing investigations. He was staying in a small apartment downtown, working as a carpenter's apprentice and attending weekly Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Linda arrived first, carrying a homemade apple pie that actually smelled edible. Her community service requirement had led her to volunteer at the Walter Thompson Foundation, the charitable organization I'd established using income from the trust. She discovered a genuine talent for helping elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation work that gave her a sense of purpose she'd never found in her previous social activities. The Madison family wanted me to thank you personally she said as she set the pie on the counter. Mrs. Madison said the foundation's legal help saved her from losing her house to those predatory reverse mortgage scammers. The foundation had become Walter's living legacy, using trust income to fund legal aid for elderly victims of financial abuse. In its first year of operation, we'd helped recover over $2 million stolen from seniors by various fraudulent schemes. Linda's work coordinating victim services had become a full-time calling that suited her much better than the idle socializing that had enabled her drinking problem. Sarah arrived next looking healthier than she had in years, but carrying the visible weight of everything she'd lost. Her 18-month prison sentence had ended 6 months ago, but rebuilding her life proved much more challenging than serving her time. Her ex-husband had maintained full custody of their children, allowing her only supervised visits until she could prove long-term stability. "I brought this for Walter," she said quietly, placing a small potted plant near his photograph on the mantelpiece. "It's a cutting from the rose bush he taught me to tend when I was 8 years old. I thought he might like having part of his garden back in the house." Sarah was living in a halfway house and working 2 part-time jobs while attending court-mandated financial counseling. The gambling addiction that had driven her desperate choices was being addressed through therapy, but she still faced years of work, rebuilding relationships with her children, and earning their trust again. Marcus knocked on the door at exactly 2 o'clock wearing the clean work clothes that had become his uniform since leaving prison. His hands showed calluses from honest labor, and his face had lost the soft appearance that came from years of office work and easy living. Prison had been humbling, but it had also forced him to confront the addiction that had controlled his decisions for decades. "The Hendersons' kitchen is finished," he reported as he hung his coat in the front closet. "Mrs. Henderson said to tell you that having grab bars and accessible cabinets installed has made all the difference in her independence." Marcus was working with a construction company that specialized in home modifications for elderly and disabled residents. Many of his projects were funded by foundation grants, allowing him to contribute directly to the mission Walter had established. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that he was now building accessibility features for seniors instead of scheming to defraud them of their homes. The final guest was Agent William Thompson, who had become something of a family friend over the past year. His investigation of local corruption had expanded far beyond our original case, resulting in the prosecution of over 30 public officials and business executives. He'd requested permission to attend our dinner as a way of honoring Walter's contribution to cleaning up the county's government. "I have an update on the Meridian Properties Victims Fund," Agent Thompson announced as we gathered around the dining table. The final asset seizures were processed last week, bringing the total restitution fund to $4.7 million. Every family that lost property to their fraudulent schemes will receive full compensation. As we held hands around the table, I felt Walter's presence in every corner of the room he'd loved so much. The mansion remained exactly as he'd left it, protected forever by the irrevocable trust that ensured no corrupt judge or greedy developer could ever threaten it again. But the house had become more than just a memorial. It was now the headquarters for a foundation that carried Walter's values into the future. Before we eat, I said, "I want to read something that Walter left for this moment." I pulled out the final letter from his sealed envelope, one I'd never shared before because it was meant specifically for the day when his family had learned to choose love over greed, truth over deception, and service over selfishness. "My dear family." Walter's letter began, "If you're hearing these words, it means you've traveled the difficult path from betrayal to redemption, from selfishness to service, from destruction to healing. The money I left to Brendan was never about rewarding one person and punishing others. It was about creating the conditions where my family could learn what truly matters in life. Wealth that isn't earned becomes a curse that destroys character. Forgiveness that isn't earned becomes enabling that prevents growth. But wealth used wisely and forgiveness earned through genuine change can transform lives and communities in ways that purely inherited money never could. You've learned that real security comes from integrity, not from accumulated possessions. You've discovered that genuine satisfaction comes from serving others, not from serving yourselves. Most importantly, you've proven that family bonds can survive even the worst betrayals if people are willing to do the hard work of earning back trust. The foundation you've built together will outlive all of you continuing to protect vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation that nearly destroyed our own family. That legacy is worth more than any amount of money I could have left in a bank account. As I finished reading, tears were flowing freely around the table. Even Agent Thompson seemed moved by Walter's final words and the transformation they'd inspired in people who'd once seemed beyond redemption. Walter always said that the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you left behind that made the world better. I continued. He left behind a family that learned to choose service over selfishness, truth over convenience, and love over money. We spent the rest of the afternoon sharing stories about Walter's influence on our lives, laughing about his stubborn insistence on repairing everything himself and planning future foundation projects that would honor his memory. For the first time in years, conversation flowed naturally without underlying tension or unspoken resentments. As evening shadows lengthened across the dining room, I realized that Walter's greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance itself, but the journey it had forced us all to take. The money had revealed everyone's true nature, but the consequences had provided opportunities for genuine transformation. Agent Thompson departed first, thanking us for the invitation, and promising to visit again during the holidays. Marcus, Linda, and Sarah lingered longer, reluctant to end what had become the first genuinely peaceful family gathering in years. "Walter would be proud of what you've accomplished," Linda said as she helped clear the dinner dishes. "Not just with the foundation, but with giving us chances to earn back your trust. He never stopped believing that people could change if they were willing to face the truth about themselves," I replied. "The hardest part was learning to believe it myself." As my family prepared to leave, I stood on the same porch where I'd confronted their corruption a year earlier. The manila folder that had once contained evidence of their crimes was now filled with foundation reports, volunteer schedules, and plans for expanding our services to help even more vulnerable families. The neighborhood around us had been transformed as well. Property values had stabilized after the corrupt development schemes were exposed, and several young families had moved into homes that might have been demolished for shopping centers. Children played in yards where bulldozers would have operated if Walter's investigation hadn't stopped Meridian Properties. "Before you go," I said, "I want you to know that Walter left specific instructions about the foundation's future. When I turn 40, control of the trust will transfer to a board, consisting of all of us plus community representatives and foundation beneficiaries." Sarah looked surprised. "You mean we'll all have a voice in how the money gets used?" Walter wanted to ensure that the foundation would outlive any one person's leadership, I explained. But he also wanted our family to have the chance to work together on something meaningful, something that would honor what he tried to teach us about using resources responsibly. As they drove away into the November darkness, I remained on the porch looking up at stars that seemed brighter than they had in months. Walter's plan had been more sophisticated than any of us had initially understood. He hadn't just wanted to expose corruption and protect his estate. He'd wanted to create a path for his family to discover their better selves. The $1 million inheritance had been bait that revealed everyone's true character. But the real treasure was the knowledge that even people who'd made terrible choices could earn redemption through service, sacrifice, and genuine commitment to change. Inside the house, I walked through rooms filled with Walter's belongings and his memory, but also with the promise of a future built on the foundation he'd established. The trust would continue funding legal aid for elderly victims, housing assistance for families threatened by predatory schemes and educational programs that taught people to recognize and resist financial exploitation. Standing before Walter's portrait in his study, I spoke aloud to the grandfather who'd given me the most difficult and valuable lessons of my life. You were right about everything. The money was never the point. Building character was the point. Creating justice was the point. And learning that love sometimes requires tough choices was the most important point of all. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like approval. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve people who needed protection from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. But tonight I was simply grateful for Walter's wisdom and for the family that had learned to choose love over money service, over selfishness, and redemption over revenge. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I carried with me the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from helping them become the people they were always capable of being. Walter's final gift hadn't been wealth. It had been the chance to learn that true prosperity comes from using whatever resources we have to make the world a little more, just a little more kind, and a little more worthy of the love we've been given. Now I want to hear from all of you who've stayed with this story until the very end. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted betrayed you for money or personal gain? How did you handle it, and what did you learn about forgiveness versus justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below because these experiences shape who we become as people. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know it was worth telling. Subscribe to hear more true stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and discovering strength they didn't know they had. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that even the worst betrayals can lead to something better if we're willing to do the hard work of choosing love over revenge. Thank you for taking this journey with me today. Remember that your greatest inheritance isn't what others leave you, but what you choose to leave behind for the people who come after you. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right, keep believing in second chances, and keep building the kind of family and community that would make your ancestors proud.